Hi, all. I'm Ed Mullen, Technical Solutions Director at Nava. I have been working across our different HR1 efforts to coordinate our different work streams. And as Sumi said, as we've been having conversations with states, a number of open source questions arise, especially from IT shops. All of the solutions that Nava has developed for HR1, whether they're on the Medicaid side or the SNAP side or open source, we think that's really valuable. It unlocks a lot of opportunities for states. But open source is one of those topics where advocates, gush about it. Very positive messaging, really, promotional language around open source. But less attention goes to legitimate questions that are coming from sort of the folks who have day-to-day operational governance responsibilities. So, yeah, we thought Brandon Tabaska would be a great person to talk to about this. Brandon, I'm excited to have you here. Before we get started, could you share a bit about your background that you're bringing to this conversation?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Ed. I'm super excited to be here. For those of you who have not had the chance to meet me yet, I am the open source lead on simplergrants.gov, which is a federal initiative which is modernizing the digital systems used to facilitate over $300 billion a year in federal grants. I also work with Nava, facilitating our open source strategy, including the CMS Claims API and Nava's Strata platform initiative. Prior to my time at Nava, I worked on NASA working on their mission assurance systems. When I think about building open source systems, I think of three things. They need to be transparent, reusable, and governable. And I think that I take a real practical perspective to how government IT leaders evaluate open source. At the end of the day, I want to make sure that systems actually get adopted and operated in real government environments.
Great. So open source is increasingly reflected in how government is governing their technology. The Bipartisan Share IT Act of 2024, talks about how source code sharing and reuse across agencies can be promoted. California has embedded open source and code reuse into its statewide IT policy framework. Virginia formally incorporates open source into its enterprise architecture standards. And then we see other similar activities in other states, Maryland, Delaware, Tennessee, West Virginia. These are all places where open source is explicitly addressed in statewide IT governance. Yet many state IT leaders still approach open source with caution. So, Brandon, why is this hesitation reasonable?
I think the hesitation is absolutely reasonable. At the end of the day, state IT leaders are responsible for making sure that all of the systems they control are secure, compliant, and of course stable, right? And that is done with tight staffing and budget constraints. And so the common worry with open source is that you could lose control of the source code. Code can come in from anywhere. It would be hard to govern. There would be no clear accountability. And if your job is protecting production systems with extremely sensitive data, like we're talking about, defaulting to that caution makes sense. What I do as I'm separating myths about open source from how well run open source actually operates in government today. End of the story, it can be done. A great example of this would be the multi state integrated benefits initiative, which since 2017, we've seen Michigan, Colorado, Alaska, and Louisiana partner together with Code for America to combine application processes for healthcare, food, childcare, cash benefits. Each state took a different piece of the pie. For example, Michigan worked to reduce the days to eligibility determination and then contributed that back. So all of the states within this cohort were able to benefit from it. And all of that was built on open source. It was rapidly prototyped across the initiative and rolled out as as each state felt comfortable.
Right. Okay, so let's start with the basics. When we say
Yeah.
a state is adopting an open source solution, what does that actually mean in practice?
Yeah, I think that in practice, all that open source means is that the application code is publicly available and licensed for reuse, meaning that it is not publicly operated or loosely controlled. It's deployed entirely inside the state's own environment, meaning the infrastructure, networking, data, access controls, operation processes, all of those are owned at the state level. Nothing about open source requires data to leave the state or systems or run exposed outside of the established security boundaries. Open source at the end of the day is really just about transparency and reuse so that you're not starting from scratch and you're not dependent on black boxes.
So, one concern that you kind of hinted at earlier that we
Yeah.
hear from IT leaders is that open source can feel like the Wild West, hard to
Mm.
govern, hard to control. How do you respond to that?
I think that concern usually comes from imagining that anyone can push changes directly into your production system. And I want to be clear that that's not how it works. In mature projects, community contributions are treated as inputs, not production changes. Contributions go through automated testing, security scanning, and human review before they release. There's a clear maintainer role which decides what's accepted and when it's accepted. So nothing changes without the intentional decision of maintainers. States get to choose when to adopt, how to validate changes. So it's really not that different from how states already manage updates from existing commercial vendors. A good example of that would be what you talked about earlier, Ed, with Code California, where they maintain an open source portal, which is a public code repository following the state's Department of Technology's order for the creation of that. What that really means is that it's delivered better support for cost efficiency, effectiveness, and really brings the public's experience into these government programs. But at the end of the day, at the state level, every group is still individually evaluating what parts of that repository they want to bring into their systems and what they think best would be to leave on the shelf.
So security and compliance, come up quickly in these conversations too,
Yeah.
especially for systems that are handling sensitive data. How should states think about this with open source?
I think this is one of my favorite questions because at the end of the day, open source does not remove the responsibility and it doesn't magically create compliance, although I wish it did. The state still owns the security, compliance, and operations. However, you can see how the security, compliance, and controls are implemented. You can do things like reviewing audit logging, access controls, encryption without relying on the assurance from third party vendors. So, open source, to be clear, does not mean no maintenance. You still require all of the scanning, patching, documentation, and auditing that you would, anyways, but you already know how to do that. It does mean that most of the work can now be standardized and automated, and fixes are usually available quickly because the code is visible and shared. So this slots really neatly into SDLC, ATO, and other security review processes, more rigor with more transparency.
Yeah, and a lot of these things fall into the category of risk. And so how should leaders really think about risk when comparing open source to proprietary software?
I think the most important thing to think about is that every system has risk. At the end of the day, proprietary systems have the risk concentrated to a single vendor. You can't see the code, you're dependent on their timelines, you have limited leverage if their priorities change or costs rise. So I really want to flip the question that you ask, which is what happens if your proprietary vendor gets acquired or sunsets a product or decides to double their licensing fees? That's really concentrated risk. You're betting on a single company's stability, priorities, and goodwill. Open source distributes that risk differently. The code is visible. Multiple organizations can evaluate it. Security issues can be identified and fixed in the open. So states actually retain more control over how and when changes are applied. So you're not automatically safer, but the risk profile is different and often, I think, more governable, especially for orgs with strong operational controls. I think that transparency makes it easier to build standards or checklists or automated scorecards over time. So really, you're not reinventing governance. You're just extending practices that you already rely on.
Right. Okay, so we're having this conversation as part of Nava's HR1 response demo day. Nava has released its open source community engagement reporting tool, Oscar, under an Apache
Yeah.
2 open source license. We've also developed open source solutions to help reduce SNAP payment error rates. So let's use Oscar as an example. Can you briefly describe how the main open source code in that repository actually gets used by the state?
Yeah, I'd love to. So you want to think of the open source Oscar repository as the product code layer. The application itself is maintained and released by Nava. So when a state decides to use it, we're not talking about them forking the code and developing against it. What's really happening is that they're deploying a released version into their own environment their cloud, their networks with their security controls. They then take the next layer, which is configuring and integrating at their boundaries, connecting to their eligibility systems, setting up these data exchanges, configuring workflows, aligning with whatever their state specific priorities are. So all of that happens within the state's environment and the repos, not within the public code base. And then over time, as Nava releases new versions, the state gets to choose when to adopt updates as they review these changes, run their own security and validation checks, and they promote through their environments on whatever schedule works best for their state.
Well, Brandon, thanks for joining us today. If there is one takeaway that you'd want IT leaders to leave with, what would that be?
It's really that open source isn't a leap of faith. It's an option that you can evaluate responsibly. If you already know how to govern commercial software, you have every tool that you'll need to govern open source. The questions are very similar. Who's accountable? How is security handled? How do updates work? And how does this fit into my environment? Open source makes those answers more transparent and just gives you control over timeline and changes. At the end of the day, I want you to start small, prove value in limited scopes, and then scale based on the evidence that you see inside of your own environment. I think that's what I would probably say. Thanks, Ed.
Thanks, Brandon. Tiffany, I'll pass back to you.
Thanks, Ed. We have time to take some questions. So if you have a question, please put it in the chat. We do have one question. You showed the VA integration. Could Oscar connect to other external data sources like state labor data or third-party systems?
Yeah, I mean, good question. Yes, that's the pattern we've established is that you can connect to other the state labor or others like commercial vendors. This could be like an Argyle or a Truve or and we have the pattern established and the protocol like available on GitHub as well. So if if another vendor did want to actually contribute and make a connection, they could do that too because it is open source. So the pattern is established, it's available, and that's the idea. We want to be able to connect to these data sources like state labor and all that.
Thanks, Sumi. And we have one more question. For leaders who want to be open to open source but still need strong governance, what does good look like at a high level?
Yeah, I think I can take this. At a high level, a lot of the things that we talk about are really applicable. So, what we're saying is that you want to make sure that you understand the risk. So, essentially, you're looking at the code and creating things like scorecards, governance systems, security reviews, and stuff like that to make sure that the open source code works within your existing environment and that you're evaluating it consistently. So, like I said, very similar to what you would expect from a proprietary vendor. It's just taking the risk and distributing it differently. So that way you can make sure that you understand how it fits within your environment. So it's different from system to system, but it's something that I think is easy to start with a limited scope and then scale based on the successes that you see. I think with Oscar being a sidecar app, that's a really great place to start with open source because the scope is more limited rather than taking your entire existing healthcare system and moving all of that to open source in one go.
Thanks, Brandon. There are no other questions at this time, so I will turn it back to you, Sumi. Or over to Ed.
Yeah, and I'll pass it to Ed.
Thanks. Yeah. Yeah. So thanks, Tiffany. Yeah, two quick last notes to share. The first is that our HR1 response newsletter was sent out on February 6th. It included a conversation that I had with Joseph Arrows Hunter, our Senior Director of Nava's State Portfolio. We were discussing some of the early successes that we're seeing in some of our SNAP payment error reduction efforts. And there really is one big lesson that is standing out as we've been working through this, and it's that moving fast pays off. We are seeing that our methods have moved the needle in as little as a quarter. Our approach starts with data analysis to understand the state's unique factors that are driving payment error rates. And from there, we can target either reuse of our existing solutions when they align with those particular challenges the state is facing, or we can undertake rapid development to implement new solutions quickly. So we'll share a link to the video here in a bit, but it's a short watch. It's worth watching, so you can hear a little bit more about that. And as Sumi said, we will have a number of people at the State Health IT Connect Summit in New Orleans last week. We'll be there for Monday's HR1 Community Engagement Day event, and then we'll be around for the rest of the summit. So if you are in town as well, we'd love to find time to chat, talk about your state's needs. You can reach out to me at my address here on the slide, or to Kari or Lukman, our client executives, and we can coordinate. So hopefully we'll see you there in New Orleans. Tiffany, I'll pass back to you.
Thanks, Ed. And thanks everyone for joining us today. Join us for our next demo day, which is on March 18th at 2 p.m. Eastern, 11 a.m. Pacific. So with that, I thank you all for joining us.